Empires are not built on mercy but on fear. Throughout human history, public executions have long been used as a method of deterrence. However, the Romans elevated punishment and the concept of justice into a brutal form of art. It wasn't just about beheadings or executions on the gallows. They created punishments that were not only cruel but also deeply symbolic, unforgettable to anyone who witnessed them. One such method was the execution of traitors by hurling them from the top of the Tarpeian Rock, a grim and infamous cliff in Rome. Yet even such traditional forms of punishment were not enough to satisfy the Romans. They constantly sought more horrifying methods to engrave a lasting message. Those who dared defy Rome would pay the ultimate price in the most excruciating way imaginable. Among these, crucifixion rose as the ultimate symbol of physical agony and public shame. Though the practice of fastening someone to a wooden structure was not invented by Rome, it had been used earlier by the Persians, Seleucids, and Carthaginians. It was the Romans who perfected it and deployed it with unparalleled cruelty. In the Roman Empire, crucifixion was mainly reserved for rebellious slaves, deserters, foreigners, and pirates. Roman citizens were rarely subjected to it, as the punishment was not only physically torturous but also carried the weight of prolonged public humiliation. Typically, the execution process began with a brutal beating or scourging of the condemned. The victim was then forced to carry their cross to the execution site. In reality, they usually carried only the crossbeam, known as the patibulum, while the vertical post, stipes, was already set up at the site. Once there, the victim's arms would be fastened to the crossbeam either by ropes or by nails driven through their wrists or hands. Some historical accounts suggest the arms could be stretched behind the beam and secured in that position. The crossbeam would then be hoisted onto the upright post, and the victim's feet would be tied or nailed to the lower part of the cross. It's worth noting that there was no standardized method for crucifixion. Much of the procedure depended on the executioner's discretion and creativity. After being raised on the cross, the victim entered a prolonged state of torment, lasting anywhere from several hours to multiple days. During this period, they suffered from shock, blood loss, dehydration, and gradual physical collapse due to exposure. The most harrowing aspect of crucifixion was that death didn't come swiftly. Suspended in an outstretched position, the victim's diaphragm, the primary muscle used for breathing, was constantly strained, making respiration increasingly difficult. In a desperate effort to breathe, the condemned would push themselves up with their legs to relieve pressure, but every movement inflicted immense pain. Eventually, they would succumb to asphyxiation when they no longer had the strength to lift themselves. In some instances, if the executioners wanted to hasten death, they would break the victim's legs. This prevented them from pushing upward to breathe, accelerating suffocation and intensifying the suffering in their final moments. When the victim died, their body could be taken down so the cross, especially the upright post, could be reused. However, in many cases, the corpse was left hanging, exposed to the elements until it completely decomposed, a gruesome spectacle meant to deliver a chilling message. To defy Rome is to dig your own grave. To drive the message home, the Romans often placed a placard, known as a titulus, above the crucified victim's head, clearly stating their name and the crime for which they were being executed. Crucifixion wasn't just a method of punishment, it was a brutal stage for public propaganda, a harsh reminder of the glory and unyielding power of the Roman Empire. Among the most infamous crucifixions in Roman history was the execution of Jesus of Nazareth, an event that took place sometime in the first half of the 1st century and later became a sacred symbol of the Christian faith. But this was far from the largest mass execution ever recorded. In 71 BC, following the suppression of the slave rebellion led by Spartacus, the Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus carried out a savage retaliation. Approximately 6,000 surviving rebels were sentenced to crucifixion, their bodies displayed along the famed Appian Way, stretching from Capua all the way to Rome. This road of death was more than just a mass punishment. It was a ruthless warning to anyone thinking of rebellion. Roman power was absolute and unchallengeable. Crucifixion continued to be used for centuries after as a method of harshly punishing those considered socially deviant or dangerous to public order. However, by the early 4th century AD, when Christianity became the official religion of the empire, this cruel practice was finally abolished, partly due to moral reasons and partly because of a shift in society's perception of human value. While crucifixion was a long and excruciating form of execution, the Romans devised another method that was faster, more violent, and, above all, far more entertaining for spectators in the arena: damnatio ad bestias, or condemnation to the beasts. The punishment was horrifyingly simple. Prisoners were led into the center of a packed arena and wild, starving animals were released to tear them apart. Lions, leopards, bears, even crocodiles could serve as executioners. The sight of beasts pouncing on human victims while thousands cheered in bloodthirsty excitement turned these executions into one of the most popular forms of public entertainment in ancient Rome. As savage as it was, this form of execution was rarely without a sense of theatricality. Sometimes the condemned were handed a dull sword, giving the illusion of a chance at survival, however slim. In other cases, they were tied to stakes and left defenseless to heighten the drama. Certain executions were even staged as full-blown performances reenacting scenes from Greek or Roman mythology, with the prisoner playing the role of the victim quite literally in the story. In addition, the form of Damnatio ad bestias was often held alongside wild beast hunts known as venations, where exotic animals were brought from the farthest corners of the empire to the heart of Rome. In these deadly spectacles, it wasn't just the condemned who became the performers. Animals themselves were also forced into the role of unwilling participants, locked in life-or-death battles against gladiators, professional hunters, and even each other. Creatures like elephants, bulls, and wild boars were sometimes used to trample prisoners to death, adding to the violent and chaotic scenes that kept audiences glued to their seats. In short, for the Romans, punishment was not only about justice, it was also a performance, a warning, and a way to dominate through fear. In a society where human lives could be taken amidst cheers and applause, blood and power became the only language everyone understood and no one dared to defy. One thing Roman arena organizers quickly learned was this: wild animals were not trained actors following a script. They didn't behave according to human expectations, and they certainly didn't care about putting on a good show for thousands of screaming spectators. Humans are not the natural prey of predators like lions or leopards, and in many cases, the overwhelming noise and chaos of the arena only terrified the animals, causing them to panic or refuse to attack at all. To overcome this obstacle and ensure the executions were as entertaining as the crowd expected, the Romans relied heavily on a class of professional animal handlers known as bestiarii. Their job wasn't just to tame the beasts, it was to program them for fury. Before being unleashed into the arena, the animals were often starved for days, pushing them into a desperate, aggressive state. Once the iron gates opened, the combination of hunger and primal instinct would drive them to attack the condemned, creating a bloodbath that brought the crowd to a frenzy. However, the cycle of brutal games didn't last forever. By around the 4th century AD, as a spirit of compassion slowly began to emerge in Roman society and gladiatorial games lost much of their appeal, the practice of damnatio ad bestias began to fade into obscurity. A more significant reason, though, was the severe depletion of the empire's wild animal populations. After centuries of unchecked hunting to fuel the blood-soaked entertainment demands of the Roman elite, the empire had inadvertently caused one of the greatest ecological collapses in human history. Still, throwing prisoners to wild beasts wasn't the only way the Romans displayed their extreme cruelty. One of the most reviled crimes in their eyes was parricide, the murder of one's own parents or close blood relatives. Such a heinous act, they believed, couldn't be punished by ordinary means. And so, a punishment even more horrifying was invented: Poena cullei, or the penalty of the sack. In this punishment, the criminal would have their hands and feet tightly bound and be sealed inside a large sack. That sack would then be thrown into a river, condemning the victim to drown, a fate already terrifying enough. But for some executioners, such a death was far too merciful. To amplify the suffering, they added 4 animals into the sack, each symbolizing chaos: a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a snake. When the sack was hurled into the water, the terrified creatures inside would bite, scratch, and thrash wildly, inflicting excruciating physical pain on the condemned as they sank into the depths of death. According to the Roman historian Livy, around 101 BCE, a man named Publius Malleolus was the first person subjected to this gruesome form of execution after murdering his own mother. He was bound, stuffed into a sack, and mercilessly thrown into the sea. However, ancient records are inconsistent about whether all 4 animals were actually used at that time. Some scholars argue that elements like the monkey or the snake appeared in later accounts, likely added as the punishment became more mythologized over the centuries. There are even records indicating that only one animal, such as a snake, accompanied the victim, as the idea of cramming 4 live creatures into a single sack and keeping them contained was likely nearly impossible in practice. Strangely enough, after the fall of the Roman Empire, this seemingly forgotten form of execution made a surprising comeback during the Middle Ages and the early modern period. One notable case occurred in 1548 when a miller was sentenced and executed using the same method, stuffed into a sack along with several animals. When the body was later recovered, only a dog and a cat had survived and managed to escape the sack. Just like in ancient Rome, the punishment of the sack in later eras remained extremely rare in actual practice. It served more as a powerful symbol of deterrence than as a widely used method of execution. At its height, ancient Rome controlled nearly 25% of the world's population. It achieved this dominance not only through military might, but also through a terrifying arsenal of punishments so bizarre and brutal that they defied ordinary imagination. In truth, Rome's power didn't just lie in its legions, it lay in its mastery of fear, projected in ways that made the entire world tremble. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more fascinating content.